Hello Raptors fans and welcome back to Raptors Report. Today we will be discussing the Toronto Raptors victory against the Orlando Magic. But before we do that, I want to talk about the trade deadline because there are a ton of rumors swirling around the NBA as we speak because the Toronto Raptors have been involved in some trade discussions allegedly between the Milwaukee Bucks and the Miami Heat as a team that could help facilitate a Jimmy Butler trade. So I want to talk about that. Also think that there's another trade that could be made, and I've kind of read the tea leaves and poked around and figured out another trade, so stick around for that. But first, why don't we talk about what's happening with Jimmy Butler and why the Toronto Raptors are involved in this trade discussion. So Jimmy Butler, there's no secret here, he has wanted out of Miami for at least the past month, probably longer, but it was kept under wraps for a while until it bubbled over and he started making comments to the media about not having enough help and how he wanted to win, etc., etc. The Heat did not take very kindly to that and suspended him, and basically where we're at now is that the trade deadline's rapidly approaching and the Heat, I think, want to continue on without him, and they want to remove a distraction from their dressing room right now and very quickly, probably before the trade deadline even happens. And there are not a ton of ways to make that happen. And in fact, one of the teams that has emerged as a Jimmy Butler suitor is not the Phoenix Suns, as you may have thought. There's been a lot of speculation on a Jimmy Butler for Bradley Beal deal. However, I don't think that the Heat really want to take on Bradley Beal's contract. I don't even know. I don't like Bradley Beal very much as a player. I think the Heat are probably in the same boat. So I think that what the Heat are looking for is maybe something that the Bucks could offer. And the Toronto Raptors could probably make something happen there because the Bucks can't straight up trade for Jimmy Butler using their own contracts. They need to do a bit more tweaking in order for things to work. So a deal that I could see happening is between the Milwaukee Bucks, the Raptors, and the Heat. And here's the proposed trade that I have here, is that Chris Middleton, Bruce Brown, and Chris Boucher would be going to the Heat. The Bucks would be getting Jimmy Butler and Orlando Robinson. Orlando Robinson is just in there to make enough salary for the Raptors. They have to move a little bit of extra salary, and he helps that happen. And then the Raptors would be getting Duncan Robinson, Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton, and Tyler Smith. And in addition to that, there would be some picks going out. So the Heat would be getting a kind of mortgaged pick in 2027 and then a 2031 pick from Milwaukee, either unprotected or, with light protections. Kind of similar to what the Suns did recently. They gave up that 30-31 pick, which is the first pick that this season has been made available for teams to trade, because you can't trade picks too far off. And that would be one of the things that the Bucks could give up, like one of those first-round picks that they haven't been able to trade. They'd be able to trade this season. So although Jimmy Butler wants to go to Phoenix, and he's made that pretty clear with the color of his shoes, his hair, etc., it's not really up to him. He doesn't have a no-trade clause, so they can trade him anywhere. And he has been talking through his agent to warn teams, like, don't trade for me. I'm not interested in playing for you guys. However, when we're talking about the Milwaukee Bucks, that's kind of what Damian Lillard was doing with them. And they called his bluff and said, listen, you're going to play with us. We don't care if you don't like it here. Suck it up. And they traded a bunch of assets for him, and now it's starting to work out. So I could easily see them doing the same thing for Jimmy Butler, getting him. They would be giving up Chris Middleton, Pat Connaughton, Bobby Portis, Tyler Smith, and then 3 first-round picks. And that's a big price to pay. Jimmy Butler only has 1 year left on his contract, but this would make them probably one of the favorites in the Eastern Conference to win a championship. He would fit perfectly next to Damian Lillard and Giannis Antetokounmpo, playing between the two of those guys. He's a great defender. He's a winning player. I mean, the Bucks know all about how good Jimmy Butler is. Like, come on. They've seen what he's done to them in the past. So they would probably be willing to give up 4 guys like Tyler Smith is a project. Pat Connaughton doesn't play for them anymore. Bobby Portis is not really a contributor. I mean, he does play major minutes for them, but he doesn't really play the game the right way. And if you watch him play, he's really kind of a tough pill to swallow. And then Chris Middleton, who has been a stalwart for them and really impressed me last season. He kind of carried them in the playoffs against the Pacers. So he would be probably the hardest guy for them to let go, but you know, you got to pay the price, and if that's what it takes to get Jimmy Butler, I could definitely see them making this trade. For the Heat, they get a guy who is probably a good culture fit with them, Chris Middleton. He's been injured most of the season, but he's come back, and I think if he gets healthy for them in the playoffs, they could use him. He's in kind of the role player phase of his career, probably high-end role player. And it looks like they just kind of want to keep going without Jimmy Butler. They seem like a team that's never going to want to tank, and he makes sense for them to help them out in the playoffs, especially with Jimmy Butler kind of dogging it for them. And then for the Toronto Raptors, the Raptors kind of get dumped a bunch of contracts on them. So Duncan Robinson, I actually don't mind Duncan Robinson. I think he's a rotation caliber player, and although his contract's pretty big for what he brings, he can do some stuff for you on offense, and he might be a good fit next to, you know, Scotty Barnes, Jakob Poeltl, RJ Barrett. He could slot between RJ and Scotty, and obviously you're giving up something on the defensive end, but he could fit in a couple of different lineups. Bobby Portis, you know, he's a decent bench big. He can stretch the floor out a little bit. He's a pretty maddening player to watch, but, you know, he could kind of be okay for the Raptors, although I'm not a huge fan of his. Pat Connaughton's pretty much washed at this point. And then Tyler Smith is kind of an interesting prospect for the Raptors to develop. He's a stretch big who played for the G League Ignite, and he's got some issues kind of figuring the game out. Like he's kind of, his processing isn't quite there yet, but the Toronto Raptors could maybe give him a couple of minutes, kick the tires on him. His contract is very cheap. They could try him out in the G League. He's playing for the Wisconsin Herd, so he's already in the G League, and he has some potential as, you know, a stretch for undersized 5 in certain lineups, so he could be an interesting piece for the Toronto Raptors moving forward. They could try and bring him into their system and develop him. And then obviously they'd be getting a future first for that. So there's some intriguing upside here for the Toronto Raptors. And then they'd be giving up Bruce Brown and Chris Boucher, who have played, Bruce Brown really struggled in his first few games of the season with the Toronto Raptors. He looked absolutely horrible, but he's bounced back as of late, and he has a pretty good track record in the NBA. I think the Heat would be interested in adding him. Chris Boucher had that like super mega tear where the 4 games he was unstoppable, and he's kind of fallen back to earth, but as we know, he's a feast or famine type player, and he'd be going to the Heat. Those are 2 pretty good role players who could help the Heat in the playoffs. I think that they'd be interested in them, and then they expire at the end of the season so that he can go out and find somebody on the free agent market. So that's kind of how the deal works for all of the different teams. I think I'd be for this for the Toronto Raptors. This is the kind of deal that that they should be trying to make, is trading Bruce Brown and Chris Boucher expiring contracts for slightly worse contracts, plus picks and prospects. So they'd be getting a prospect and a future first for Chris Boucher and Bruce Brown, which is decent value. And then Duncan Robinson's kind of, you know, an intriguing piece.